I learned yesterday about the Patti LuPone scandal. Are you familiar with this?
Does it have to do with Patti LuPone being racist or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, debatably, but yeah. So like a few weeks ago, she gave an interview to the New Yorker, and apparently like her show on Broadway shares a wall with another show that is like a majority black cast, and she said that they were too loud, and then that predictably sparked a backlash, and then she called like Audra McDonald a bitch. And now she like got it disinvited from the Tonys, and like it's a whole like to do and stuff like that. And so I just learned about this yesterday. I was like, oh my goodness.
Does this
Tough.
mean that within the next week she's going to be on Substack? Because it is literally Cancelvania over there.
Like, I would subscribe to Patti LuPone's Substack.
You cannot like what's the expression? Like swing a dead
cat.
And
it's a weird subscription, yeah.
Yeah, and not hit a Cancelista in Cancelvania. I think we should on Substack vote for the prime chancellor of Cancelvania. At the moment, it might be Terry Moran.
yeah, he's getting a lot of votes. Yeah. King of the Cancels.
Lest we forget that Cancelvania was first populated by like right-wing cancelistas.
Oh, totally, yeah.
And now it's becoming populated by like left-wing cancelistas.
Hashtag both sides. And
both sides.
Cancelvania is becoming a swing state.
Cancelvania is becoming a swing state. I like to think, does being laid off count as being canceled?
No, absolutely not. You were not canceled, Galen.
I'm not a cancelista?
No, sorry. Do you want to be a cancelista?
No. I mean, the time will come soon enough.
If you keep going at the rate you're going.
Hello and welcome to the GD Politics Podcast. I'm Galen Druk, and we've got a lot to talk about today. So I had originally planned to open up the mailbag and answer listener questions, which we're still going to do. But before we get to that, I do want to talk about some of the news since the last episode. So last Thursday evening, Israel began bombing Iranian military targets with the goal of preventing Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons. And the two countries have continued to exchange fire in the days since. Friday night, a man who's now in custody shot two Democratic Minnesota lawmakers and their spouses, killing State Representative Melissa Hortman and her husband, and wounding State Senator John Hoffman and his wife. Minnesota Governor Tim Walz described the attack as, quote, targeted political violence. On Saturday, President Trump hosted a military parade in Washington, D.C., marking the 250th birthday of the U.S. military, which also happened to be his birthday, and protesters gathered around the country under the banner, No Kings. Not that we need anything more to discuss, but today, June 16th, also happens to be the 10th anniversary of Trump's descent down that escalator and entrance into political politics. Political politics? Presidential politics. Sorry about that. You can already hear his laughter in the background. Here with me is dear friend who spent the majority of those 10 years sharing a newsroom with me, Nathaniel Rakich. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Galen. Yeah, it was a heck of a ride, and it's not over yet.
It is not over yet. As I mentioned, we got a lot to discuss, but you alerted me to the fact that it was this anniversary this morning. It was the first thing I saw when I woke up. Do you have any thoughts on this, the 10th anniversary of Trump's entrance into presidential politics?
I mean, I don't think I have any particularly deep thoughts, but I think that basically almost since that moment, he has been the defining kind of rock of political politics. And
should we rename the podcast?
Yeah, GD Political Politics. GD's Political Politics. Yeah, everything has revolved around him. You know, even when he wasn't the president, things were kind of in reaction to him and the movement that he created within the Republican Party, bringing things in a more populist and anti-establishment direction. And, I think both parties are still kind of trying to figure out how to navigate that. And again, yeah, it's not over yet. We still have 3.5 years left of his presidential term, and we also don't know what's going to happen after that and whether the Democratic Party is going to respond by going in a more populist direction. We don't know whether the Republican Party, how it's going to move on after Trump. But I think there's no question that he is one of the most important figures in this century's politics, for better or for worse.
Yeah, I have some more thoughts reflecting on President Trump, how he's practiced politics, maybe even lessons we can learn that I'm writing up that folks may see sometime soon. So I don't want to give away too much.
Ooh,
But
you
some
can
days
write too, Galen?
I can I'm literate. It's crazy. Uh, but some days it feels like he's shaped the Democratic Party almost as much as he's shaped the Republican Party. And I'm curious if there are any lessons that Democrats can learn from the way that he's practiced politics over the past 10 years. But I'm going to leave it there, and we'll come back to that. Let's go in chronological order, Nathaniel, since pretty much hours after I published the last episode in this feed. So are you ready to play Middle East expert?
As ready as I'll ever be.
Have you ever seen there's YouTube videos where they play pranks on people? They'll be set up in Washington Square Park or something, and they're like, okay, we have a TV crew here where the person that we planned on interviewing stepped away for a second or isn't here. Can you just stand here for a second? And then they'll pretend that they're all of a sudden putting them on live TV and introduce them as an expert in something in particular, and then start asking them questions and see if they just say, oh, sorry, I shouldn't be here on live TV, or if they play along and start answering questions as if they are the named expert. And it's incredible, the people who just play along with it. I think it might actually literally be expert on Middle East politics or something like that.
I have not
Anyway.
seen that. That's amazing. Is it like all the men like try to bluff their way through it and all the women are like,
I don't,
no, don't
I
talk
don't
to
remember
me.
that specifically, but based on some of the YouGov polling that we've recently discussed, it wouldn't shock me. I was trying to track down polling since the war began between Israel and Iran, and I couldn't even find that. What I was able to find was polling that was conducted right before on hypotheticals. So there's this one poll from the Ronald Reagan Institute. I'm quoting here, 45% of those surveyed said they would support Israel conducting targeted airstrikes against Iran's nuclear facilities if diplomatic efforts between the U.S. and Iran fail. 37% said they opposed, 18% unsure. And then the partisan breakdown was 6 in 10 Republicans support, 35% of independents support, and 32% of Democrats support. There's a lot of caveats in that, if diplomatic negotiations break down, it was before any of these airstrikes actually happened. Do you think that that data even tells us much?
No, not really. I mean, yeah, hypothetical polls are always, they can be good guides if you have nothing else, which in this case we do. I also went and looked for things, and, I expect that like YouGov, for instance, will probably come out with something in the next couple of days, but it doesn't seem like anything's been released yet. But people's reactions when things actually come true can be very different. We saw this with things like, Trump's conviction and, Harris jumping into the race after Biden dropped out. So I'm going to reserve judgment, but also like it's not the most important thing, right? Or the other thing too, right, is the Ronald Reagan Institute, is a conservative think tank. It probably has a point of view, not just kind of a conservative, like Republican, kind of the way that or we think about Republicans now, but also kind of like Ronald Reagan old style conservatism, which is much more about, like
More interventionist than
exactly
the
right,
Trump Republican Party.
having a bigger role in the world. So
Came from the Team America World Police Institute, actually, if I can cite this poll for a second.
Yeah. So basically, we should treat this like an internal poll, and it's a hypothetical poll. So yeah. But I mean, I think my prior is, with regard to this, that like Americans are probably going to be pretty freaked out that this is happening. We know that, for instance, they weren't huge issues in the election, but like the general sense that the Russia-Ukraine war and the Israel-Gaza conflict were kind of happening contributed to a sense of chaos, I think, around the Biden administration and, kind of dissatisfaction with the direction that if not the country, the world is kind of heading in. And this kind of would add to that, I think, and it's something that's going to put people on edge. I think in terms of, where public opinion might come down, I think, we have seen, obviously Israel is generally popular with the American public being an ally, and that has kind of decreased a little bit as I think the conflict in Gaza has developed. And a lot of people, particularly on the left, obviously, have come to be more sympathetic toward the Palestinian cause. But I think even in polls that are kind of like the worst for Israel, you still see about a 50-50 or at least an even split between the two. But I think in comparison to Iran in particular, I think that most Americans are probably going to side with Israel. But again, it doesn't necessarily mean that, Israel, go bomb Iran. Like, I think probably Americans are going to be nervous about this development. But again, we need to see more detailed polling.
Yeah, so it's worth saying here that when you look at Trump's approval rating, he does worse on foreign policy now than he does overall. I'm just going to cite RCP here, Real Clear Politics, because I don't see foreign policy separated out from either of our friends, Nate Silver or Elliot or the New York Times. But RCP's average for Trump overall is net -4, and his approval on foreign policy is net -9. So although that may have been an advantage against Biden when people felt like Biden didn't have a handle on foreign policy, it's not an advantage now, particularly above and beyond what Americans already view. You brought up the question of Israel, and I think it's really interesting. CNN actually did quite a good write-up on this recently, and I'm going to quote extensively from them because I think they put it better than I could off the cuff in terms of how some of these views are shifting. Now, to your point, when it comes to comparing Israel to Iran, there's no comparison. The University of Maryland Critical Issues poll asked something along the lines of, who do you think should have nuclear weapons? Israel, Iran, both, neither. Americans generally preferred neither. It was 69%. But in terms of only Iran having nuclear weapons, it was 1% of Americans. So at that point, you're kind of rounding down to nobody
just people
thinks that Iran
punching in
yeah, exactly.
the B answer for every question. Yeah,
exactly. And for what it's worth, 10% said only Israel should have nuclear weapons as a comparison point. Actually, 6% said both should have nuclear weapons. So that's a little higher than 1%. And it was
a lot of people believe in mutually assured destruction.
Exactly, mad. And that was even across the partisan divide. 7% of Republicans, 6% of Democrats, 6% of independents. Anyway, I mentioned that there's some good polling on how Americans view Israel, a year and a half on from the war with Gaza. And here I'll quote, polls for decades have asked Americans to choose whether they sympathize more with Israelis or Palestinians, and Israel is almost always the runaway favorite. But a new Quinnipiac poll showed Americans sided with the Israelis by a historically narrow margin, 37% to 32%. After Hamas's October 2023 terror attack on Israel, that margin had been 61% to 13% in Israel's favor. So a 48-point edge has shrunk to 5. They go on to say, that's not only the lowest advantage for Israel since Quinnipiac began polling this question in 2001, but it appears to be about the lowest since at least 1980 across multiple polls, according to data compiled by the Roper Center for Public Opinion Research. They continue on to cite some other polling, which was also interesting. A February Reuters Ipsos poll showed that about 4 in 10 Americans leaned toward the idea that Israel's problems are, quote, none of our business. What was particularly striking about that last one, these views were almost completely nonpartisan. It was 4 in 10 Democrats, independents, and Republicans who said Israel's business was none of ours. Thank you, CNN, for providing me with that much content. But Nathaniel, I'm curious for your thoughts about all that.
Yeah, so I think that's an important part of it too, right? Is that Americans, I think, led by Republicans, are also getting more isolationist generally over the long term. And I think that feeds into it as well, that like, again, in the abstract, they might prefer that Israel win a war between Israel and Iran, but they don't want that war to happen. They don't want America to be involved. They don't want the war to affect their lives as Americans. Obviously, Trump, as we mentioned, has been taking a more isolationist direction for the Republican Party. There was a report recently that said that he had vetoed a plan by Israel. Israel was going to allegedly take out the supreme leader of Iran, and Trump said, no, you shouldn't do that.
And that was an internal leak, right? So I
I think
assume
so.
the Trump
Right.
administration would have given that information to the Wall Street Journal. So, in some ways, that is shaping the narrative. Always important to keep in mind. Where does this information come from? What do they want us to think as a result? But yes, the Trump administration seems to want Americans to think that they don't want.
Right. And exactly. And I think they want to show that the United States is not trying to exacerbate the situation, which is obviously good. Maybe it's good politics domestically, but it is also obviously good for not inflaming the situation internationally.
Okay, let's move on and talk about another difficult topic, which is political violence. So we still don't have a lot of the details on the assassinations and assassination attempts in Minnesota, but talking about political violence, Nathaniel, is unfortunately not new for us. I think the place where we've left off, or where we've usually landed when we talk about this from a data perspective, which of course is not the only perspective here, is that a lot of polls will come up with numbers in the range of 20 to 30% of Americans supporting some kind of political violence. But more rigorous research suggests that that number is far too high. And when you use polling mechanisms to ensure that people are paying close attention to the questions that you're actually asking them, you get numbers closer to the low to mid single digits, which would be 2 to 5% of Americans, when forced to think about it in a more concerted way, still supporting political violence. That nets out somewhere in the range of, I don't think we're asking 3-year-olds about their views of political violence. So if you do the math of just people over the age of 18 in America, it's somewhere in the range of 10 to 15 million Americans. But even that number is still not all that important, because how many people did it take to assassinate a Minnesota lawmaker? It took one person to assassinate a Minnesota lawmaker. So, that's where we've left things in the past. I'm curious if we have more to add, Nathaniel.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's all exactly right. That support for political violence is still very low, and that is reason for optimism. But any support for political violence is bad. And you do see, kind of in the non-polling data, you see that political violence has been on the increase, right? We are in an era of political violence in the United States. And that, I don't think, unfortunately, will surprise anybody who's paying attention to the news and, some of these things like Trump's assassination attempt, or other political violence, January 6th, obviously, that we have lived through, unfortunately, in the last several years. But there have been some good studies that have been done.
Do those numbers include, for example, the protests when they turn violent? So, for example, in the summer of 2020, when folks were attacking, a courthouse in Portland, or even, setting Waymos on fire in Los Angeles, does that count as in the political violence data?
I think it depends, obviously, on the study. So, Reuters did the study that looked at both, all sorts of violence. So that included property destruction as well as fatal attacks or attacks on people. And so they probably did. I don't want to speak for Reuters, but for instance, they logged 58 instances of violence among dueling groups at public demonstrations and events. So maybe that would fit into it. 73 instances of violence resulting mainly in property destruction. So it could, I think, depending on the methodology, right? But so speaking of this Reuters study, they did a really good investigation of this a couple years ago now, so it's a little bit out of date. It's from 2023, but they found that we've had these moments of political violence in the past. So for instance, in the 1970s, but that was the 60s and 70s, and obviously 1968, a year of a lot of assassinations. But overall, during those times, it was actually mostly property damage. And this spike in political violence that has happened now, which has basically started in 2016, has been much more focused on people, which is obviously very scary. There was also a good study out of Princeton University of the Bridging Divides Initiative that looked at different types of political violence, and they found that vigilante activity was on the rise as a proportion of political violence. So I think, I mean, I didn't conduct the study, and I don't know exactly how they coded things, but my impression is that this Minnesota shooting would probably fit into something like that. They also noted that there could be a lot of issues with trust around like first responders and like police and stuff like that, because the number of police killings has also been on the increase. And in 2024, it reached a 10-year high. So the concern there is that, especially in these environments where you have, maybe protests and then police kind of cracking down, or other law enforcement as well. Obviously, Trump also sent in National Guard and Marines, that those crackdowns could decrease, kind of continue to widen the divide between the protesters and the authority figures, which could lead to more incidents like that. So I think there's a lot of reason in the data as well to be concerned. I'll actually add one more thing from the Princeton study, which found that they logged more than 600 incidents of threats and harassment against public officials in 2024, which was a 10% increase from the previous year, and an even bigger increase from 2022. It was almost twice as many. So yeah, again, just putting numbers on something that we already kind of know anecdotally.
Yeah, and from a non-data perspective, it's just worth saying that what happened early Saturday morning / Friday night is extremely fucked up, and sad for all of us in America, and particularly sad for the community in Minnesota. And to think, I think it's been for a while that we've known that federal lawmakers are targeted and have spoken openly about their death threats, but these are state representatives who you're more maybe used to seeing at the mall, at the store, what have you, who are now obviously also afraid for their lives. And we've talked about, even election workers and things like that,
right,
being afraid.
And exactly. And like, those people obviously have less protection, right? Obviously the president is very closely guarded. But, members of Congress, for instance, I went to the congressional baseball game last week, and there's always a big Capitol Police presence there because they're really freaked out by these threats. And there was that shooting in 2017 at a practice for the congressional baseball game that I think was also a seminal moment for this, and kind of happened represented, I think, a transition into this period of political violence. But yeah, a state representative is fairly anonymous, and maybe that we've been lucky where January 6th obviously people died, but no elected officials died, which I think easily could have gone another way. And this shooting in Minnesota is an example of an elected official actually dying, and I think that it hopefully will be the last, but I don't think that we can count on that.
Yeah, there was a headline from a piece of analysis from the New York Times over the weekend that said, we've become inured, or something along those lines, to school shootings. Are we going to become inured to things like this? And I hope that the answer is no. Let's move on and talk about the protests and military parade over the weekend. Nathaniel, you mentioned that you were at the congressional baseball game. You were also at the combination protest parade in DC over the weekend. You're really just, Forrest Gump here, going to all the important events. You were at
I'm unemployed, Galen, so I'm just bopping around and seeing what there's to see.
Well, even the last time we spoke as employed people, you had just left the non-State of the Union where Trump was speaking. So yes, you're really taking advantage of your location in Washington, D.C.
That is true. In all seriousness, it is. We are living through historic times, and I think that, not that the congressional baseball game is that historic, but it is interesting, I think, to see this stuff in person, and I think it gives it a texture that is difficult to get from somewhere else. So I do feel lucky to live here and be able to see this stuff. But yes, I did not actually attend the parade itself. I didn't go inside the security perimeter. Speaking of security, it was extremely hunkered down. A large portion of the mall was fenced off, and there were only, I think, a couple of security entrances, and the main one was near the Washington Monument. And it was just too much of a madhouse. So I kind of hung out outside. I was curious to see, the crowds, both, the people who were presumably pro-Trump and pro-military parade, and the people who were obviously doing the kind of No Kings protests. And yeah, it was interesting. They were definitely, it was not, as bad as it could have been in terms of certainly violence or kind of confrontation. There were a couple of pockets of kind of left of center protesters holding their signs and kind of doing some chants, but they really didn't interact much with the very predominantly Republican crowd based on the things they were wearing, MAGA hats, like Trump shirts and stuff like that. But it was fairly respectful. It was, we'll talk about crowd sizes, I think, but inside the perimeter, based on the photos I saw, it did not seem very crowded. It was pretty crowded, certainly more crowded than downtown DC was normally, and especially as people were funneling into that security area. So I do think that there was probably an element of some people were deterred by the line, or just kind of were late to arrive to the parade because of the security line. But it does seem like the attendance. It was also raining, I should say, or like it was kind of a dreary day. It was like lightly drizzling. So the military parade maybe was not as big of a spectacle as Trump wanted it to be, but crowd sizes are not where people need to be looking when kind of assessing support for these things.
Well, you're teeing me up perfectly here,
Yeah.
Nathaniel. So, a frequent pastime for the sort of Trump versus resistance crowd is comparisons of dick size. Sorry, I mean crowd size. And so, according to the Trump administration, there were 250,000 people watching the parade on Saturday. Organizers of the No Kings protests say there were 5 million people in attendance to their protests nationwide. Obviously, comparing a single event in Washington, D.C. to a national event is nonsense. So that's not what I'm trying to do here. But we do know from a data perspective a couple things about trying to estimate crowd sizes, because this is actually a mathematical problem. So how accurate are crowd size estimates, Nathaniel?